everybody. Welcome back to the Invite Me In podcast show. Today is so special.
It is special.
It is special. We have a very powerful, amazing guest that is going to join us today, and you're going to be able to see him and hear from him. We're excited to announce him. Today, we're continuing our discussion and training and collaboration with all of you, our audience, on our concept of Shiberby. It's EIE Consortium's intellectual model on how to look at every student, every human being's personal cultural framework. As you know, in previous discussions we've had, you've watched, we have a combined view over the years of experience about what a person's cultural framework is, and it's not completely represented in all the cultural sensitivity work out there. The three of us, we believe that every human being, as we've talked about, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, if you're born on this earth, you have a cultural framework. We have coined that as Shiverby. And there's seven, it's an acronym. Just as a reminder, the 7 elements of Shiverby are spirituality, a person's household practices, their interactions and communication styles, their own value system, their ethnicity and race, their religion, and belief systems. Today, as promised, we're doing a deep dive into the spirituality layer, protective layer of Shiverby. With that, we have invited a gentleman who is a prominent speaker. He is a prominent activist out in the public square for good. He's a voice for the indigenous tribes and peoples of the North American continent, and he's just all around a respected guy. So with this, I'm going to have my sweet wife lead this conversation, and we would like to welcome him. With that, we're going to look at spirituality today through the lens of Shiverby and through the lens of our guest.
Yes, absolutely. Welcome, Darren. It's so nice to have you here. First of all, I would like to read just a short bio that Darren has provided us so you have an understanding as to who he is and what he's been doing. So Darren Parry is the former chairman of the Northwestern Band of the Shoshone Nation. Darren serves on the board of directors for the American West Heritage Center in Wellsville, Utah, the Utah Humanities Board, and the PBS Utah Board of Directors. He attended the University of Utah and Weber State University and received his bachelor's degree in secondary education with an emphasis on history. Darren is the author of The Bear River Massacre, A Shoshone History, and teaches Native American history at Utah State University. His passions in life are his wife, Melody, 7 children, and 17 grandchildren. His other passion is his tribal family. He wants to make sure that those who have gone before him are not forgotten.
Mr. Darren Parry, welcome. Can I give you an opening kind of lens to look through our discussion today? And take this wherever you'd like, my good man. We're thankful for you taking some time with us. So,
well, thank you for having me. It just seems like education is important to you, and I'm grateful because education is important to me. And my father was a teacher. My siblings have been teachers. I'm a teacher. And so being able to instruct our youth and make a positive impact for our children is something that's deeply ingrained in me. But also deeply ingrained in me was the fact that I'm Native American. Our tribe was indigenous to northern Utah. And so I grew up in the area where our tribal families have grown up for thousands of years. And so but going to school one day, I think I was in high school, I realized something. None of the stories that my grandmother told me as a tribal elder are in our history books today.
Right.
And so that resonated with me in a way that really changed me and my perspective going forward. And then, remembering the stories that I'd heard from a grandmother, a tribal elder, a knowledge keeper, they just came flooding back. And I realized that many of our people have never had a voice before. And so I've been working the last 15 years to make sure that Native American voices, Native American perspectives on not only our environment, but all aspects of life are heard and recognized. I want to be a voice for those who have never had a voice, who have never had a seat at the table. And so my work has kind of reflected that the last few years, is to make sure that my Native American culture is highlighted. And because I think there's such a lesson that my people, the way they lived, there's a lesson in that, in how I think this world going forward needs to adopt and change. And
Could
so I think we're at a place now in America that we need this indigenous wisdom.
could I address, Darren, something you said in there that was really impactful, and
Sure.
it was really correlatory to our Shiverby model and the topic of spirituality. You made a comment in there that you want to help those of your people who have been forgotten or misunderstood about who they are. That's the thank you for sharing that, and that's your life's work. That is the idea of this Shiverby model. Is it's getting other people, actually. The topic of our podcast is called "Invite Me In." We want to teach the general populace to ask to be invited into other people's personal Shiverby. For example, teachers and students, colleagues at work. You said that. With that, it'd be a great segue into these questions, if I could. Uh,
Sure.
what say you on this? So spirituality is the first of our 7 acronyms in Shiverby. We have defined that, and I'm going to pull it right from our literature, folks, and one of our training manuals that we do with organizations. Spirituality, quote, meaningful connections students or humans experience with a source or concept that is bigger than self, which can result in a deep sense of interconnectedness. Spirituality we define as a direct reflection of others' concepts of their place in the world and their reckoning of self and purpose. Students and adults alike, they experience the growth in the spiritual realm of their life of their spatial relations, meaning part of their spirituality is they're seeking to envision their future selves, where they fit, and the person they're developing into, especially driven by a force or an idea higher than themselves. So, with you, and as Brittany talks to you, could you kind of help us from your perspective with our Indigenous brothers and sisters? Where does that definition coalesce or not with that other with spirituality?
Hearing you say that, it was almost like you listened to my grandmother. And so, one thing you really need to understand is, to Native Americans and Indigenous peoples, uh, all things are spiritual. All things.
Mm.
I was taught at an early age that all things have a spirit and that all things are connected. So it brought joy to my heart when I heard you say that, the connectedness of all
Interconnectedness,
things,
sure.
because there's not a separation. And when I heard my grandmother talk about our plant and animal and water kinfolk, that
Yeah.
that taught me early on that every relationship that I have with the environment and with other people, that it mattered, that we were all equal in some way. And when you consider everything having a spirit and all things are connected, and my relationship is a spiritual relationship with the earth. I have spiritual relationships in every interaction that I have every day, because we're all connected in some way. And one thing I've learned is Western values teach us that all things are not connected, and we all have different value systems, and we all have individual rights. And Native American communities aren't like that. Instead of we all have individual rights and to get ahead at all costs, our worldview is always one of, I have obligations. I have obligations to the past, to the present, and the future. I have obligations to my community and to every interaction that I have in every day. That those interactions need to have a spiritual background and a spiritual basis, because in some way and in somehow, that everything we do is connected to the next thing we do. And so my worldview to the earth and the environment and how we treat it is different than what I've been taught in school, that it's okay to extract and deplete and then move on. That's not the way we treat our relatives. It's not the way we treat our friends. And so my relationship to those things are just as important as any relationship I have with human beings. And so I think that's a big misconcept of what people think about Native Americans is we believe that we're just part of the ecosystem. We just play one small part, and what we do should reflect that. And we're no better than anything else, including our plant and animal kinfolk. My grandmother knew songs of the plants. She knew their names. She spoke to them in ways that you would have a conversation with a neighbor. And so, growing up that way, you just grow up with a different worldview of our responsibility within that. We're just one small cog in the grand scheme of this wonderful world that we seem to live in, but a world that we seem to be destroying because most humankind have lost that value system and lost that way.
Darren, thank you for really bringing some meaning and shedding some light on the idea of interconnectedness.
May I ask a follow-up question before you move on?
Dr. Taylor, please. Yeah.
Darren, what age were you when you discovered, well, from a developmental perspective, when you discovered that your grandmother was telling you these special stories and you were not seeing them in what you were taught in school? What did that look like as a realization for you, and how did you cope with that?
That's a really good question. I was lucky enough that my parents both worked. So I'd get dropped off to my grandmother's house at an early age. I grew up learning to beadwork and brain tan, and I grew up immersed in this culture, indigenous culture. And then it wasn't until I really went to school and realized that, and sitting at her feet as I learned these things and hearing the stories the way the elders had taught her through storytelling and imagery, and learning that way really shaped my early childhood. And then finally realizing as you go to school, and it wasn't in early school, it actually took until high school, a history class in high school, that I finally realized is my teacher said we were going to talk about Shoshone culture one day, and she gave a lesson on Shoshone culture at Clearfield High School. And I sat there and thought, well, this is nothing like I'd grown up with. None of the stories that my grandmother told me are in our history books. And it really caused me to think and question, how could that be? And so, because I thought historical events were an absolute. I thought events that transpired had one conclusion. But as I've gotten older, I've realized that history is about perspective and whose perspective.
And it's about who
And
writes
then one
it.
day it became clear to me, Winston Churchill said that history is only written by the victors. Well, that makes perfect sense then why Native American perspectives and those worldviews are not heard or written.
Sure.
And so it took me well into high school to finally figure out, even though I'd learned a certain way from tribal elders and then the Western worldview of education, that we're missing something here, and we're missing a voice, an indigenous voice that has been silenced because they have not been able to tell their story. And so
Darren,
I've been working hard to do that.
Sure, you have been. You have been. And a lot of people could attest to that. Darren, as we transition here, next question, my parting question to piggyback off Dr. Taylor is, what is the big picture concept for you that you want to share about about spirituality through that lens of every Native American student, adult, elder, whomever, they have a spiritual aspect of their culture, of the Native American indigenous culture. Are you saying that their spirituality is much bigger than what we have even talked about as a team? It's much more encompassing. Your concept of interconnectedness that we talk about in our definition, you pulled in a connectedness to all things. So thank you for sharing that aspect. You shed some light on what our own beliefs are, and we can take for you shared and learned from it. So Brittany, thank you. Darren, that was great.
One of the things I wanted to address is our previous podcast. We've been talking a lot about bullying, and particularly with groups who may have a different cultural framework. So, what are some of the themes that seem to be common with Shoshone students that seem to be the target for bullying? Is it the spirituality? What is it?
It's spirituality, and it's so many things. Look at Native Americans through this lens. That as I look back at history, and I look back at the federal government's resolve to completely wipe them out. Well, if we can't wipe them out, we need to beat the Indian out of them, take the Indian out of them in boarding schools. And then, I just look at the historical trauma that has been laid at the feet of Native Americans in the history of this country. And we could even make a case that are still being laid to the feet of the Native Indigenous populations today. That historical trauma it's brought on many different things, and they take many different ways. I've heard psychologists talk about how that trauma, intergenerational trauma, has actually changed the DNA of the people, of the relatives. And so when you look at it that way, and you start looking at many of our students, and not only Shoshones, but many Indigenous students, having low self-esteem. I think that, as we talk about bullying, I think that plays a major role in that. A lack of cultural identity.
Right.
Because look, the Native American culture they were trying to take it out. The boarding school motto was kill the Indian to save a man. And so when you try to erase a cultural identity, but that cultural identity still exists on reservations today, your psyche, your mental ability to function takes a huge hit. There's so many things, negative stereotypes, as people even today look at Native Americans sometimes as lazy, drunk. They're drug infested reservation systems. And the other big key is they live in poverty. Many of those Native students today don't have the resources that many of their white children and counterparts that go to school with them do. And so when you factor in all of those things, low self-esteem, a culture that has been completely tried to be erased, and then an educational system that doesn't value the way Native American kids learn through storytelling and observation and things like that, you start factoring in all of those things, it's easy to see why Native American children don't succeed in the classroom today, in the public school classroom.
Darren?
And there's many factors that play into that, but part of that is that historical trauma that still exists today.
Speaking of that historical trauma, I also am aware of some research. I think it was Dr. Lanida Warjack.
Dr. Warjack out of Fort Hall, Idaho.
Right. Yeah. She made a claim in her book that institutional trauma or intergenerational trauma had been encoded in the genetic makeup. As I think about how can we put a positive slant on this, is there a possibility that the warrior part of the Native American has also, the warrior meaning the strong part, the part of me who will stand up and who will defend the victim? Is there a possibility that there's an element of that we could focus in on and tell stories to to our children about that positive part, the warrior part, the strong part.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's part of the possibility. That would be one aspect that we could actually make. And I talk a lot and share a lot of stories about becoming a chief, becoming a leader.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that whole narrative is becoming a warrior. But I'll tell you, the resiliency of Native Americans for the last 400 years is really remarkable.
Ah,
I mean,
I love
one
that.
takeaway is we're still here.
Yes.
And
Yes.
in spite of the world wanting to either eliminate us or change us and take the culture away, that we're still here and we're still, in some cases, thriving, and in some cases, still trying to find that identity.
Sure.
And a lot of times it has to do with, no funding on school reservations to, there's many aspects that really play into that. But what I love to tell children every time I go to a class, I went to 70 elementaries last year to share my culture. I tell people before I leave, if you didn't remember one thing I said today, remember that we are still here. We're still communities that are trying every day to live our best selves, honor the culture, honor who our people were going forward. And how do we do that best? We honor them by, I think, as an educator, especially as an educator, is getting yourself educated, using education as one of the bullets in your arsenal to succeed in the future. And that needs to be the weapon of choice for Native American kids going forward today is we need to use education as the key to make a difference and change.
And stand for making a difference.
Stand for it.
Jonathan, can I ask you to share that story? You had a young man enter your office one day, and it really made an impact on me. The impact was that there is something here that this young man is fighting for. He has a belief system. He has a spirituality about him, and he's going to share it with you. Can you share that?
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you, Jocelyn, and Darren, thank you. Darren, as I've shared with you, I have the opportunity to be a superintendent and principal in 3 different reservations. And one of the things I've learned, the genesis, actually, of our Shiver-Bee model, a lot of it has come from exploring the disparages between our Indigenous friends and what's understood about them and the beautiful aspects of their own Shiver-Bee models. With that, I had an experience when I was a superintendent recently in a reservation school. I loved them. They were my second family. I felt so welcome there. Concept of being invited in came up in our mind because that's what especially our Indigenous students need. We need to be invited into their world because they're not going to actively do it out of trust, or they know that someone adult in their life might not be there. Even in the education world, they come and go. And so this young man, during this week of Cultural Heritage Week, he came to school, and he can do this because it was on the reservation. I loved it. And, culture is part of the curriculum there. So their Shiver-Bee, their value system, their religion, their spirituality, their household practices, their belief system, all comes out in a school there. And I love that. This student showed that during this week of Cultural Heritage. He came out to school, he had his hair pulled back nice, but he had his face painted in war paint. I remember old colleagues in my position would have said, you need to go home and wipe that off. That's against school policy and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I said, no, brother. I know there's a story in your face right now, and I want to hear it. I pulled him in my office, and he sat down, and he said, you know what, Mr. Brock? I'm at war today. And in our culture, we wear war paint. It's a spiritual thing. It's a symbol of what we believe in on our face. We show it on our face that we're warriors, like Dr. Taylor said, like you talked about. I said, can you tell me what that war paint is for? And what are you fighting against today? He said, Brother, Mr. Brock, I'm a warrior against injustice. I'm a warrior against alcoholism. I'm a warrior against all the complex stuff that happens to us. And I believe that if we understand each other and we really try, we can pull out of this. He said, I am standing against injustice, hate, fear, bullying, and my war paint is to win the battle to bring light into life. He said, "Thank you for asking me." And as he left, he said, "God bless you and your family."
Aw.
That was one of the most tender experiences I've had with spirituality. He wore it on his face, his interconnectedness with his religion and his world, right there. So anyway, thanks, Darren, for letting me share that.
Yeah, and he understood it, and he could share it in a way that really
proudly.
There was no misunderstandings there, and how beautiful! What a wonderful thing.
Yeah, mid-high school age young man who knew what he stood for. He knew his value system and believed it. There was no question. And he shared it in his very expression through a very cultural element on his face. So thanks for hearing
Because
that.
he'd been taught by an elder. An elder had taken the time to share
That's exactly
those
right.
values
That's
at an
right.
early age. So
what his elders teach him and any of his peers as Indigenous kids, that's their shiver in a lot of ways. What the elders pass down, values, practices. Anyway, we have some more questions, Darren. Could we get to those, sir?
Okay. Sure.
Let's see. Some of the things we were wondering as well. What are like public education? What is public education doing well to enhance and protect and nourish a Native student's cultural framework? What's actually going well?
Do you see trends in schools that are really taking that on with Native?
Yeah, I see trends in school districts. I think some public schools get it, and I think some districts really get it. Just locally, I think the Nebo school district really understands the issues.
Oh,
And I'll tell you what they. Let me tell you what is successful and why I think it works with the Nebo school district. They've funded the Native American initiatives. They've hired a really good Title VI coordinator.
Excellent.
And they're making sure that all of those Native American programs are highlighted within their district, and having strong input from the Native American populations in that district really, really helps, because they're not teaching out of an old history book. They're pulling in the Native American people in their community, and the whole community is engaged in the educational process, and not just the few white people that work in the district.
Right.
So
Right.
they've made a heavily investment in telling the Native American story from the Native American perspective. And some districts are way better than others. They all try to do it, but some of them, and maybe it comes down to leadership. Maybe I know the leader that leads the Title VI program in the Nebo School District, and she is just phenomenal. And the resources that she uses to pull in, that are resources that are available for most districts, she just gets it done. And the district has taken on this as part of who they are, and it really needs to work that way. And so, and other districts pay lip service to it, but really don't invest much time and effort into including that Indigenous perspective into their curriculum.
Thank you, Darren. Thanks for sharing that. Questions,
you,
thoughts
Darren.
on his comment? Anybody? Dr. Taylor?
the Nebo School District, you don't work for them, right? What school district have you
No,
worked for? Okay.
I don't work for them, and they're down in the Provo area.
Okay.
But I
yeah,
know
yeah,
All
yeah,
right.
Springville, yeah.
there's a large group of Native Americans that live in that area, and maybe BYU has plays a little prominent role in that. But their leadership in the Native American communities are strong.
Okay.
And I think they demand that, I think over the years, they're just demanding to have a seat at the table, has really gave them a seat at the table. And they're actually driving the ship today in many of the initiatives and programs they're doing in that school district. So I wish I could say that was true for everybody. But I think school districts that really engage tribal leaders in the process, because after all, we're talking about sovereignty. We're talking about sovereign nations
So
that
tell
have
us
the
more,
ability to
what you mean by sovereignty for our
sovereignty.
our guests that may be hearing this for the
Yeah.
first time.
And what I mean by sovereignty is when the government signed treaties to Native Americans, they gave them sovereignty, which is self-determination, the ability to determine their path forward as they go forward. So Native American tribes today are sovereign nations that reside within a state, within a nation. And you could view us as Canada. We're a sovereign nation and we need to be treated that way. And the government says that we have the ability to self-determine our future, education, and other
Does
things
that
like
mean
that.
you write your own sovereign nations? Do they write their own curriculum? Do they make their own laws? Do they?
Yes, we have our own laws. We have our own law enforcement. Some communities are better at it than others. Some partner with local school districts because of there's always lack of funding on a Native American reservation. That's always the problem. But many partner with outside school districts and make, a combination of both. But there's many schools that go it alone. And it's like the Navajos down in the Four Corners area. Many of those schools struggle because they can't get teachers that want to come live so remote.
Right.
And there's many challenges to those places, but the government gave the ability to the Native Americans to self-govern themselves, but they don't always give the financial resources to make it work great. And so that's when the state steps in, that's when local school boards step in, and they try to make it work.
They do.
And in many cases, they do make it work, and it's certainly getting better than it used to be.
And that what you just said is happening locally in several areas where there's a number of our Indigenous folks and friends at school districts, and they really are working hard to partner. They really are. Question for you. I think there's a positive side to sovereignty with a tribal nation in North America. Here's what it is. I've seen it as a superintendent on reservation districts. It literally allows the school to practice the elements of Shiver-Bee in terms of we can have cultural events at the beginning, middle, end of the day. We can sage the building. We can cedar. We can have prayers. In the cultural teacher's room, my son and I one time, when he was there with me as a principal, I took him and I down there because we had awful bronchitis. And our brother Ramon and one of our students, Wyatt, sang and did a healing while Wyatt sang with the feather. I love that a school on a reservation can have culture as part of their curriculum. I loved going in the mornings and Monday mornings and having sage and having a prayer in the language and talking about spiritual aspects, meaning students, how are you going to connect with the world today? We could start school week that way. And that was a nice insulation, is to be able to have Shiver-Bee come out in these schools because they're not held to church and state. And to me, that was the most beautiful aspect in a reservation school.
Well,
No, and I agree. It's a beautiful part of who they are. And I had an elementary school student ask me one day, well, when did the children have time to go to school? It seemed like, because Native kids back in the mid 19th century never went to school, they felt ripped off, I suppose. And so, but I told them that winter was always the elders' time to tell stories. But our education system is based in storytelling and in ceremony. Ceremony that you just talked about, sweat lodges and saging and burning many of those things that created a beautiful ceremony of healing.
Oh,
And so that was just part of everyday life. It wasn't this or that.
It still is today. One of my board members, he invited me to a sweat and he prayed over me, he prayed over our staff, he prayed over the students. Their spirituality helped our students have some extra strength to make the connection of the world around them at school. That was just a neat blending of that culture.
Well, I had a tribal elder tell me once, he said, and he was not talking to me, he was talking to a group of white men. He said,
Yeah.
You white men go to church one day a week. You practice your spirituality one day a week. But to my people, every day is a spiritual day. We practice our religion every day, from the time we get up to the time we go to bed. And so we don't ever, all things are spiritual, and all things in our life are that way, and that's just who we are as a people.
Thank you.
Wow,
And Darren,
thank you.
thank you. That was a powerful last statement. That was that warrior statement that Jocelyn was talking about earlier.
One of the fears that I have had and some of my colleagues have had is the fear of cultural appropriation. So doing something, having a microaggression, in other words, doing something inappropriate that you didn't realize was appropriate, like having fringe, wearing fringe on a bag or something like that. I was told that that could be viewed as offensive to the American, Native American culture. So there's some fears out there that we might go too far, and we might be too politically correct. Is that a real thing? Cultural appropriations, like
It
black
is a real thing.
or feathers or beads? Are there some things that are very sacred that the general population should be aware of and know of?
Yeah, and I think you can say, has the pendulum swung too far? I don't think so, but fringe. There's things that are certainly inappropriate. When Bountiful changed their mascot from the Braves, the term Braves isn't necessarily something that bothers me. The term. What bothered me was the students at halftime wearing sacred headdresses,
Right.
and things of that nature. And as I told the principal, I said, they're not doing it out of to be disrespectful or to be racist or biased. They're doing it because they just don't know.
Exactly.
And so
That's
I
exactly
said,
right.
whether you change your mascot or not is not a thing to me. But let's use this as an educational tool going forward to tell students and faculty and staff what might be appropriate and what's not appropriate, and use it as a tool that we can all learn from, as opposed to a way to shame somebody.
Sure.
And so, they ended up changing their mascot, and I didn't care whether they did or didn't. But I just thought, going forward, there's things that we can learn together to make it a much more more of a learning experience for all the students. And then you'll know what's appropriate and what's not, and you won't have to worry about some of those fringe items, may I say, no pun intended.
Darren, I have to tell you, you've triggered my memory again to one of my choicest memories, most recently working with our Indigenous kids during graduation ceremony on the football field. It was the most stellar, amazing thing for me. I've seen it before over the years here, but they came out in a processional from the school out to the football field. There were students and others dressed in headdresses. One of our elders on the staff, who was a veteran, wore his full set, and he danced out there. All of the students' caps were beaded, and we loved it. I think every element of those students' shiver bee was respected and reverenced in that ceremony, from their household practices, which is beading the cap, to the dancing, which is part of their spiritual and religious. Their ethnicity was so powerful because it was theirs, But their value systems were really honored because the students valued portraying their traditional beliefs, because for them it's a rite of passage in a very big way. They're going to wear their cultural emblems through this rite of passage of graduation. So I was reminded of that as you said that. In conclusion, with what you've shared today, we and our audience would love to hear this. What are some ways that we, the collective world, can help nourish and protect and even insulate and empower? What can the rest of us do to help be invited in to understand the shiver bee beliefs, the shiver bee elements of our Indigenous friends? Do you have any advice for us? What does invite me in look like from your perspective?
Invite me in means that we take the time to learn about these Indigenous cultures. And one thing about the state of Utah, we have 8 Indigenous tribes. We're all different.
8.
We all don't have the same story. We look different. We have our different governments, different languages. And I think it's a wonderful opportunity to learn as much as you can about those cultures, especially as they're located in your area. take the time and really be genuinely interested in looking at a people that you may have looked at it a little different. One of the problems our society has is we tend to judge people who look different than us, maybe talk different than us, and we really don't take the time and effort to understand who they are and why they may appear to be different. But I promise you, we have much more in common than we don't. And as we take the time to learn about these different tribal cultures and why they do what they do, and I'll tell you, there's so much beauty in the culture of others. And our societies will be much better off as we embrace those differences and learn from each other. But it only happens and it comes as we get close. It's hard to hate when you get close to people.
Exactly.
And learning those cultural values of different groups, and especially indigenous groups that have this worldview of how all things are connected and how all things have a spirit, will only benefit our world in the long run as we get to know that perspective and maybe adopt some of those principles that our Native American brothers and sisters have always lived.
Mr. Parry, that was a wonderful,
That's beautiful.
wonderful summary. I'd like to honor you and honor one of our friends in the Indigenous professional world, Dr. Lynetta Warjack, out of Fort Hall in Idaho. We actually commented, we actually quoted her in our literature. What our role is to learn about the kids. We said the literature suggests, we called this Bridge the Gap. The literature suggests that American Indian youth suffer from generational trauma. We know that. You know that. I experienced that with my roles on reservations, complex and historical trauma. Dr. Warjack claims that trauma is encoded in the genes. Dr. Warjack explained the current situation in which the youth experiencing deliberating psychological traumas and identified the characteristics of healthy Native students and a comparison of where they are now and where they need to be. And she says in the end, all of this becomes the goal and the obligation of teachers and educators. The power educators have to help students heal from their trauma by being invited in to learn about their cultural framework. So that's my takeaway from this. Thank you. Thank you. Ladies, any other thoughts?
Oh,
Darren, it's been such an honor to have you with us today. Thank you for taking the time. We know that you are a world traveler. You're all over, so thank you for dedicating this time to us. Anything else?
No.
Dr. Taylor?
I'm-
Hey.
Darren, could you give our audience and subscribers out there, our followers, could you give them just a maybe one sentence conclusion? Invite me in. Like, folks out there, Mr. Parry, what's your message in one sentence? How do we make it happen in a healing way?
Well, for me, it's simple. I believe, and I've always believed that the most successful Native Americans today are those who can best balance their culture and change. We honor our culture. We honor those who went before, but we live in a world of unique differences that we all bring to the table. And the best way we can is to learn and grow together is we need to be able to change, and we need to be able to bring the strengths that we have to the table and share them with those who don't have those strengths, and vice versa. We need to make sure we're listening and learning from one another. So grateful for the chance to
thank you so much.
share a few minutes with you.
Balance. I love that. Balance and change. We can do that.
Darren, thank you.
Thank you.
Friends at first and friends at last. Thank you for that. We look forward to collaborating with you. We also want to we'll also let everybody know, again, that Brittany brought up that Darren has a book that's published. We'd encourage you to find it. It's in our...
Darren, where can people find your book?
Please, lead them to it.
Well, it's on Amazon, and that's, they print it. It's in Deseret Book. They carry it. There's many bookstores that carry it.
The name of your book is?
It's, I have one here because I was sending it.
Hold it up.
There it is, yeah.
The Bear River Massacre, a Shoshone History.
Well, there you go,
I promise
listeners.
you, there's only one chapter on the massacre, though. And then the rest is about Shoshone culture and values
Probably
and storytelling.
Probably including things you may have talked about today. So,
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
to our listeners,
So,
go out and grab that book. I think it will change your life.
thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Perry, Dr.
Thank you.
Taylor, Miss Brittany. Is there anything else you want to share with our audience?
I'm pretty satisfied.
Everything was well
Thank you.
said. Thank you, Darren.
We look forward to you all in our next episode. Remember, this is the Invite Me In show. This is powered by the Experts in Education Consortium. Darren being a part of that consortium now, part of our think tank and value giver. And just remember, this is where experience and passion come to heal. Till next time, everybody. Thanks again.